Now, as the name of the video implies, this is part 9 of a story, so unless you want to be really confused, I'd recommend starting at part 1 and working your way back here if you like it. I'll include a link to all previous parts in the description below. And without further ado, let's get back to the story. We're in the control room in Yavin Base, and things look much like they did in A New Hope, only Bail Organa is there, Leia is dressed in Jedi robes, and as we hear all wings reporting in, it's not Luke that we hear say Red 5 standing by, but rather Anakin. And when he does, we see Leia shut her eyes and take a deep breath, clearly trying to calm her nerves. And then her eyes suddenly shoot open as if she's heard something, only no one else in the control room is even looking at her, much less appears to have spoken to her. She seems to be about to let it go, to chalk it up to her imagination, when we too hear a voice, a very familiar one, and Leia's face is suddenly full of hope and disbelief as she subtly leaves the control room, getting barely a curious glance from anyone. And a moment or two later, she's in an otherwise abandoned corridor when we see a small, shimmering blue figure appear before her, which causes Leia to fall to her knees as tears of joy well up in her eyes. "Master Yoda," she says, how can this be?" Yoda replies, "Learn I did, a path I may one day teach you to follow." Leia looks confused, but it does not overshadow her joy. Why didn't you tell me about this, that you might come back?" Yoda lowers his head. "Unsure I was. If successful, I would be. Consume me the dark side did at the end, but overcome it, I did." Leia shakes her head. "But I still don't understand. How can you be here?" Yoda points at her. "Because here you are. Strong is the bond between master and apprentice. Unbreakable, even." Leia suddenly looks worried. "Unbreakable?" She looks upward, her thoughts clearly going to Anakin up in space. "But my father said the Emperor was on the Death Star, that he could feel him, that this would be his chance to destroy him. But if there's still a bond between them..." Yoda's head bobs up and down slightly, and he cannot hide a look of concern. "Face Darth Sidious, your father must, and defeat him alone, he cannot." To that, Leia springs to her feet. "Then I have to go to him. I have to help him." Yoda quickly responds, "No, ready for such a challenge. You are not. Powerful Sidious is." Leia nods as if understanding. "Then you're going to help him." But Yoda shakes his head. "Interfere, I cannot. But there is another." We then jump scenes and get a shot of the Rebel X-Wings and Y-Wings getting ever closer to the massive Death Star. And then we're inside one of the X-Wings and see Anakin, who is listening to R2 let loose a string of beeps and whistles. When he's done, Anakin grins and says, "No, R2, I promise I'm not as reckless as I was back then." But then Anakin's face goes blank, and there is a bright flash, and we suddenly find ourselves in a distant memory of Anakin's, in a rapidly ascending elevator on the planet Coruscant, with Anakin and Obi-Wan inside of it, in a scene very similar to the one in Episode 2, only they are much younger than they were then, and look like they did in Episode 1. And by how awkward and uncomfortable the two seem to be around each other, we can guess probably happening very soon, maybe even days after the Battle of Naboo, and before the two have had a chance to form any type of bond. As the elevator comes to a stop, Anakin looks up at Obi-Wan and asks, "What am I supposed to say to him?" Obi-Wan gives a slight, almost sarcastic grin and says, "The new Supreme Chancellor is a politician, Anakin. I'm sure he'll do most of the talking." Anakin gives a bit of a frown to that as the doors slide open, and the two are immediately greeted by none other than Palpatine himself, who smiles broadly. Anakin and Obi-Wan start to get off the elevator when Palpatine raises both hands in an apologetic manner and says, "I'm afraid, Master Kenobi, I asked only to see young Anakin." Obi-Wan's eyes narrow upon Palpatine as he replies, "I see. Well, that is a highly unusual request, and I must insist that..." But Palpatine interrupts, and for only the briefest of moments, we see a dark look as he says, "The only thing highly unusual here is a recently knighted Jedi questioning a request of the Supreme Chancellor." Obi-Wan then looks completely abashed, and can do little more than bow and offer an apology as he backs into the elevator, closes the doors, and leaves Anakin with Palpatine. "Ah, Jedi," Palpatine seems to ponder aloud, as if he's forgotten Anakin is standing there. "Is there no limit to their audacity?" He then glances down at the nervous-looking Anakin. Forgive me, Anakin. The last thing I'd ever want to do is cast a doubt over your decision to become a Jedi. Not that it's a choice the Jedi usually offer, what with how they usually take children at such an early age and all." Palpatine again smiles broadly. "But perhaps you will be the start of something new, a change for an order that finds itself growing ever more prideful." Anakin then says, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not sure I understand." Palpatine nods. "I know you don't, Anakin. That's why I'd like to be your friend, to help you, just like you helped me and my people. Because you see, saving the galaxy is what I'm meant to do, and I think you can help me do that." Anakin looks more confused than ever, but before he can say anything, Palpatine goes on. "You do want to help people, don't you? It is why you want to become a Jedi, I'd imagine." Anakin nods enthusiastically. "It is, and one day I want to go back and save my mother. She's still a slave on Tatooine." Palpatine's look becomes regretful, and he shakes his head as if hearing that truly troubles him. "Slavery, it is the greatest blight upon this galaxy. We in the Republic have passed anti-slavery laws, but without the help of the Jedi to enforce them, I guess they do little good." Anakin looks confused and a bit angry and asks, "Why don't the Jedi help?" Palpatine shrugs and replies, "You'd have to ask your master Obi-Wan about that." Anakin frowns and says, "Every time I try to ask him something, he says I need to have patience, and that everything will become clear in time." Palpatine nods. A common Jedi response, I'm afraid." Anakin seems to be in thought for a moment before he says, Maybe I shouldn't become a Jedi?" Palpatine shakes his head. "No, Anakin, I truly feel you should, because I think you can become a better type of Jedi. Even at your young age, you already understand that some of the Jedi ways should be questioned. But for now, lock those questions away, learn all you can from them, and one day, perhaps, you shall be the one to change everything." We're then back in the present, and inside Anakin's X-Wing, and hear R2 beeping madly. "I'm fine, R2, don't worry," Anakin replies before we then hear Wedge say, "Red 5, everything okay in there? We got TIE fighters incoming, and you're out of formation." "Don't worry, I'm on it, Red 2, Anakin replies, before we get a few scenes of Anakin taking out one TIE after another with ease, much to the amazement of his fellow pilots. Finally, we hear Red Leader say, "Red 5, take Red 2 and 3 and set up for your attack run. The rest of us will keep those TIE fighters as occupied as we can for you." Anakin replies, "Understood, Red Leader, this shouldn't take long." We then see Anakin, Biggs, and Wedge in formation descending towards the Death Star trench before we're back in the cockpit with Anakin and see yet another flash and are once again seemingly transported to another time and place. And this time, we're in the Opera House scene from Revenge of the Sith, and we hear Anakin ask of Palpatine, "Is it possible to learn this power?" Palpatine gives him a look and says, "Not from a Jedi," before pausing for a long moment and adding, "Or perhaps I should say, it's not one of the Jedi secrets they'd be willing to share with you, Anakin." "Secrets?" Anakin echoes. "What secrets?" Palpatine pretends to go back to watching and being enthralled by the show and casually says, "The secrets Master Yoda keeps to himself, of course." We can then see in Anakin's eyes that his thoughts are racing, and he asks, "What secrets? How would you know about them?" Just then the entire audience begins to clap, and Palpatine along with them. Anakin, however, looks impatient and says loud enough to be heard over the applause, "What secrets?" Palpatine glances over at Anakin, almost as if he'd forgotten he was even there. "Lovely show, wasn't it?" is all he says. Anakin, at the limits of his patience, again demands to know what secrets Yoda is supposedly keeping. As the applause die down, Palpatine says, "It may surprise you to know that I was once good friends with Count Dooku, and that one of the reasons he left the Jedi Order was because he knew Yoda was keeping something from him, something important about the very nature of life and death itself." Again, we see Anakin in deep thought before he says, "What else did Dooku tell you about this?" Palpatine shrugs casually. "Not much, really. But if Yoda wouldn't share this knowledge with his trusted Padawan, and Dooku was even believed by many to succeed Yoda as head of the council one day, it must be quite a secret." Palpatine then gets to his feet and motions for his royal guard to come and escort him out, but not before adding to Anakin, "Dooku even thought it might have something to do with why Yoda had lived so long, a secret his people had discovered about the Force a long time ago, and one they refused to share." There is another flash, and we're back in the present, and hearing R2 let out an alarmed screech as Anakin pulls up just in time before crashing into the Death Star, and then he steadies his X-Wing and starts to fly down the trench. We then hear Biggs say, Okay, we get it already, no need to keep showing off." We then hear Anakin say, his voice just a touch unsteady, "Sorry, old habits and all." We then hear Red Leader ask, "Everything okay down there, Red 5? Anakin replies, "I am fine, just getting used to how these X-Wings handle is all." We're then back in the control room on Yavin, and focused on a nervous-looking Bail Organa, as someone comments to him, "He doesn't even have his targeting computer on." And that's when Leia re-enters the control room and says, "He won't need it." Bail gives a wry smile to that, but eventually nods and says, "I hope he does this." Leia takes her place next to him around the display and says, "He can do this." Bail then replies, "I know he can do this. I said I hope he does do this." Leia says nothing to that, and instead glances over her shoulder, and we see that standing behind her is the shimmering blue visage of Yoda, though it's quite obvious no one else can see him but Leia, and she then gives him a small, hopeful smile. In return, all Yoda does is give her one resolute nod of the head, his face completely impassive. We then jump scenes, and we see Maul's Mandalorian ship flying through hyperspace, and a moment later, we're inside in the cargo bay, and see Ahsoka kneeling and in meditation, but every so often, her face contorts as if in pain or fighting against something. That's when we see Luke enter, and he says, "She's fighting you, isn't she? The one that body really belongs to, I mean." Ahsoka opens her eyes and gives a wicked grin. "Fighting me? No, young one. I'm merely wiping out the last remnants of her. Soon she will be no more." Luke then asks, "Who is she?" Ahsoka quickly replies, "Who was she, you mean? Your father's Padawan, Ahsoka Tano." Luke looks confused. "Padawan? What's a Padawan?" Ahsoka rolls her eyes. "I forget. Your Jedi training was conducted by Maul, who likely didn't teach you anything about the real Jedi." Luke looks annoyed, but asks, "So what's a Padawan? A fancy name for an apprentice or something?" Again, Ahsoka rolls her eyes. "Still so much to learn, young one. But at least you ask questions now instead of just assuming everything. That's a big first step." Luke takes a deep, calming breath. "So it's just an apprentice then?" "No," Ahsoka says. "A Padawan is much more than just an apprentice. A deep and powerful link is formed between Master and Padawan, and for a Jedi, there is no greater responsibility than to train the next generation, and no moment more joyful than to see a Padawan become an equal, or even a superior." Ahsoka frowns and finishes, "And for a Sith, there is no moment more dreaded than for an apprentice to become an equal, and especially a superior." Luke then says, only seemingly half interested, "So, this Padawan of my father's, she was powerful then?" Ahsoka shrugs. "She could have been, if the Jedi hadn't betrayed her." Luke seems surprised to hear that, and Ahsoka continues, "Yes, young one, it is not only the Sith who can betray their brethren, but also the Jedi. In fact, the only Jedi to stand with Ahsoka when she was wrongly accused was your father, Anakin Skywalker." We then jump scenes again, and we're back with Anakin in the trench, who is easily avoiding the streaking green turbo lasers. We then hear Wedge mutter, "Almost there," before there is yet another flash, and we are again teleported through time and space, and now find ourselves on the shore of a lava river on the planet Mustafar, watching Palpatine kneel down and tend to a defeated Anakin. And that's when we see, also standing upon the fiery shore, and watching this scene, our Anakin as we know him to appear in the present, and next to him is the hunched and decrepit form of Emperor Palpatine, as he would also look in the present time of our story. Palpatine then says as the two look on, the clone troopers rushing off to get the medcart, "I saved you that day, after what the Jedi did to you, and now you come here, seeking to destroy me and undo all we worked together to build." Anakin shakes his head. "You lied to me about Padme. I didn't kill her. She lived and gave birth to my children." Palpatine then replies, "You're doing it again, my old friend. You're falling for the lies and deceptions of the Jedi. They're using you now as they have always used you. You have never been more than a tool to them, one they would not grant the rank of master despite being more powerful than all of them." "I didn't deserve to be a master," then Anakin replies, still not taking his eyes off the scene from the past. "I had so much to learn. If only I could have realized that, everything would be different right now." Palpatine snarls, "You do have much to learn, for you have yet to realize that it was indeed you that killed your beloved Padme that day, but one kept her alive just long enough for her to give birth before letting her die. Birth to weapons he would use to destroy both of us, Lord Vader, for he was not strong enough to defeat us himself." "No," Anakin says, but there is the smallest hint of doubt upon his face. "No, Master Yoda would never do something like that." "And yet," Palpatine begins, "he knew Padme's final fate, didn't he? Which means he was there when she died and somehow failed to save her, and then hid your children from you, and then trained them to turn you against me so that you would destroy me. And then he never allowed you to return to Tatooine, did he? to liberate your mother and the other slaves, no matter how many times you asked. He even ignored an executive order by me, your true friend, to do this very thing. We then see Anakin's hands ball up in a fist, and Palpatine smiles and continues, You've never truly been one of them, Anakin. You've always been greater than any Jedi. Embrace your destiny once more. Embrace the dark side and become more powerful than any Sith or Jedi I've ever been. There is another flash, and we're back with Vader in the cockpit of the X-Wing, and he immediately breaks off and leaves the trench. We're then taken to the control room back on Yavin, and hear Wedge say, Something's wrong. Red 5 is disengaged. I repeat, Red 5 is disengaged. We then see Bail Organa slowly turn his head to look at Leia, his expression half sad, half accusing, but Leia doesn't see it, for she has hung her head and has her hands braced upon the control panel before her, as if it's the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Behind her we see Master Yoda's head lower as he shuts his eyes tightly. He takes one deep breath and lets it out slowly before turning and walking away, and then slowly fades away into nothingness. We then switch scenes and get a shot of the planet Jakku, and suddenly a ship comes out of hyperspace, and that ship is Maul's old Mandalorian ship. We're then on board and in the cockpit with Ahsoka and Luke, who look upon the planet. It's Luke who then says, Great, another desert planet. But Ahsoka doesn't seem to hear him. Instead, her eyes and attention are locked on Jakku as they draw ever closer. Do you feel that? She says, but Luke only shakes his head. She then continues, her face contorting as if she's in pain. The light side, it's strong here. She's trying to use it to... We then switch scenes again, and we're back above the surface of the Death Star and see Anakin's X-Wing on the tail of Wedge's X-Wing, and then we're inside the cockpit with Anakin and see he has locked onto Wedge and is about to fire, much to the dismay of a beeping and whistling R2, when suddenly there is yet another flash, and we find ourselves on the steps of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant during the waning days of the Clone Wars, and Anakin is watching as Ahsoka walks away from both him and the Jedi Order. But suddenly Ahsoka stops and turns around, and we see she is not a child as she was then, but it is Ahsoka of the present. Anakin, she says. Anakin, is that really you? We now see that, like Ahsoka, it is the Anakin of the present, and he says after a moment of confusion, Ahsoka? Snips? Ahsoka then smiles and runs towards Anakin, and flings her arms around him when she reaches him, but Anakin only stands there, still looking confused as he says, But I killed you on Malachor. And after he says that, a great wave of pain washes over his face, and he says again, No, I killed you. Why did I do that? That's when Ahsoka pulls back from him and says, No, Anakin, that wasn't you. That was Vader, and you two are not one and the same, because you're far stronger than he could ever hope to be. I always knew you'd come back. I never doubted. I never stopped believing in you, Master, and I never will. Anakin then says, But you still died on Malachor. Ahsoka then quickly replies, No, I was saved by the spirit of an ancient Sith that had been trapped in the temple, and she still possesses me. Anakin shakes his head. I don't understand. And there isn't time to explain now, Ahsoka says. I only have moments before she regains full control again, and it won't be much longer till she gets rid of me forever. I need you, Master. You're the only one who can defeat her. You're the only one that can save me from her. There is another flash, and we're back in the cockpit with Anakin, his finger about to pull the trigger and vaporize Wedge. But he doesn't. Instead, he breaks off, and we see him flying his X-Wing back towards the trench, as we also see several new waves of TIE fighters approach. We then jump back to the control room on Yavin, and hear the announcement that the Death Star will be in firing range in 1 minute, before hearing the voice of Anakin say, This is Red 5. There's too many TIE fighters for me to make my run. Is anyone left to watch my back? Leia's head pops up, and she locks eyes with Bail Organa, and both have a look of nervous hope upon their face. But then we hear the chatter of the few rebel pilots left, and they all say they're either out of position or being pursued by too many TIE fighters themselves. We then hear another voice that doesn't belong to any of the rebel pilots say, I'll keep those ties off your back. You just get in that trench and make that shot. We then see Leia's face absolutely light up as she says, Kanan! We're then back at the Death Star and see Anakin's X-Wing and Kanan's Jedi Starfighter as they shoot their way through the waves of TIEs and back towards the trench. Anakin then enters the trench, and Kanan flies above, picking off more TIEs and just trying to be a distraction. And it works, for it isn't long before Anakin reaches the end of the trench, fires his proton torpedoes, and makes a 1 in a million shot. And as the Death Star explodes, Anakin is once more transported this time to an illusion of the Jedi Council chamber in the temple on Coruscant, and he stands in the middle of it, and before him is the shimmering blue visage of Yoda, who simply says, "Granted the rank of Jedi Master, you have been." And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to let me know what you thought of this part of the story and what you think is to come as we draw ever closer to the end. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.